Thank you for inviting me, and welcome to everyone to this session on preparing for asset and service devolution in the context of LGR in Devon. As Karen said, my name is Carl Hearn. I'm Clerk and RFO at Tavistock Town Council, and the slides seem to be going all over the place.
Yeah, we're getting there.
Um, And in a previous life, I was also joint governance lead for the One Cornwall Unitary project for Cornwall Council. I suppose there's a bit of context. There are some complex topics in play here, and there's a lot of uncertainties still in situ. So, from a practical point of view, this isn't intended to be a definitive guide. It's very much about the sorts of things that we can be thinking about now and the sorts of things that we should be thinking about going forwards. And hopefully, whatever the size of your council, it gives you an opportunity to work out what is going to work for you in the context of local government reorganisation, and indeed whether or not there are things that you do or don't need to do. Some of the slides are a little bit on the busy side, but don't worry, they are going to be circulated. And I guess the other thing to point out is that asset and service transfers, if and when they take place to town and parish councils, which is one of the primary impacts of LGR, or local government reorganisation, they can be on any scale. It can be a leisure centre with 80 or 90 staff. It can be something as simple as a litter bin. And therefore, there is something which is about being proportionate to the size of your council, to the size of whatever assets or services might or might not be coming your way, and indeed to your aspirations. The presentation is in three parts. And there'll be an opportunity for questions at the end of each part. What I would say is if as we go along, there's something which isn't clear or a point of clarification that you need, then pop that in the chat, and Karen and Rebecca will be keeping an eye on that, and then they can actually sort of draw that to my attention as we go along so that it makes sense. The other thing I would say is before I start, I express my appreciation to colleagues at Salcombe, Totnes, Dawlish and Truro for their input into this and for their thoughts around it. What I would say is any errors or omissions are absolutely certainly mine and mine alone. I do have a bit of a cough, so if from time to time I splutter, I do apologise. Could we go to the next slide, please, Karen? For those of you over the age of 40, the Donald Rumsfeld quote will be very familiar. I think really what this is here to do is to actually say, if you look at what's in italics at the bottom, there are some things that we might be treating as certainties which are not yet certain. Government's announced a timeline, but that timeline is indicative at this stage. It hasn't been incorporated into a statutory process. It certainly hasn't been incorporated into statutory orders, which would address things like over what time will LGR take place in Devon, what the configuration of Devon will be in terms of a new unitary or a number of unitaries, and what the scope of that will be, and how that might link to strategic authorities and other proposals. And similarly, each of your districts will be in a different position financially, politically, and administratively in terms of what they do and how. So there is a very real possibility that some of the things that we take for granted at the moment may change. And it's really, I guess, to a certain extent, a health warning. With the next slide, please, Karen. This is just a little bit of context. The power under which local government reorganisation will take place is included in the Local Government and Public Involvement in Health Act 2007. That's the same legislation as delivered it unitaries in Cornwall, in Wiltshire, and other parts of the country back in 2009. Of course, we've got the English devolution white paper, which is causing, if you like, where we're at the moment. But in that context, it's probably helpful to think of LGR not as an end in itself. For government, it's a means to an end. And that end for government is having strategic authorities comprised of unitary building blocks, which are led by an executive mayor. And therefore, we are incidental in some ways to what government's main priorities are. Now, whether that aspiration from government is good or bad is really one for another day, but that's the context within which we find ourselves. I suppose in the context specifically of Devon, the bullet point which talks about competing bids, consensus or conflict is also something that we probably ought to recognise. Devon is in perhaps not a unique situation, but a situation which sets it apart from a number of other county areas in the sense that certainly last time round, when indicative bids were put in, my understanding is Devon had more than any other county in the country, and we can expect at least three. So I think it's reasonable to expect that there's going to be a 5-4-1 bid from the districts. There's going to be an Exeter City Council bid, and there's going to be a Devon County Council bid. And of course, there are always the possibility of permutations around Plymouth and Torbay as two unitaries within the county. And of course, Devon is complex because you've got the districts, you've got the unitaries, and of course, you've got the combined authority. So it is not straightforward politically or administratively for government. And therefore, I would suggest there is a high likelihood that if there is going to be local government reorganisation in Devon, it will come from a direction by government rather than from consensus breaking out in the county. I may be wrong, but I think that looks to be the likelihood. And the question then arises as to whether or not, in the context of local government reorganisation, Devon runs with the pack, in other words, most of the rest of the country to the timeline that government has issued, or is there a possibility that we're in the too difficult box and we run a bit later? And of course, you don't have to run very much later to be running into a future parliament. So just to flag that element of uncertainty. The bullet point, which is talking about driving your council's agenda, I guess at this stage, again, it is helpful just to understand where you're at. Some councils are going to be really eager to take on assets and services. For some, that will be anathema. It won't be what you want to do at all. For some, there will be opportunities. For some, there won't. But in the context of understanding what your drivers are and what the benefits are for your community, that will help to contextualize some of the starting position, which is going to inform where you go from here. Could we go to the next slide, please, Karen? The focus of this presentation is, of course, on the asset and service aspects of LGR rather than area-based working. But that locality working work stream is going to be a very important part of a new bid. Now, we know that government has said that there need to be neighbourhood boards and panels, and it's talked about community governance arrangements. It's not really particularly strong in terms of links to town and parish councils. But in the absence of more guidance at this time, I think we need to see whether or not the bids begin to really articulate what that's going to be and whether or not there's a dependency between asset and service devolution coming out of that locality work stream or not. And if there is, then of course that makes it more likely that asset and service delivery aspects will be carried forward to the new unitary rather than delivered by principal authorities, the districts and the county at this particular time. I should also note that Devon County Council have already extended an invitation through Devon Association of Local Councils to join in a conversation on what locality working arrangements might look like as it develops its bid. And hopefully that's something which other bidders might be prepared to do to ensure that the town and parish council sector itself is involved and engaged. If we can move on, please, Karen. So to manage all our expectations, it's helpful to look at what's happened previously. I mentioned statutory orders earlier. These are issued by government and they set the criteria under which any successful bid can proceed. In practice, at the point they're issued, they typically prevent asset transfers. Therefore, depending on the timing of those statutory orders, there may or may not be a window, which could be months or even years, within which principal authorities, if they wish to do so, could act to devolve assets and services beforehand. Looking to the localism strategy, as I've said, there are links in terms of how that can actually drive itself into what the policy is regarding assets and service devolution. But critically, knowing what your principal authority thinks now, today, about whether or not it's willing to engage in that kind of a debate is really helpful. It saves you wasting time. It helps you in terms of your planning and preparation. There are some principal authorities which outside of local government reorganisation, I understand, are already looking at some element of devolution. I think Teenbridge is one of those in terms of things like public conveniences, and that's driven by factors, as far as I'm aware, which aren't to do with LGR. There may be some authorities which are prepared to run before LGR and actually say, well, we will have a discussion with town and parish councils, either in principle or actually about specific assets and specific services. But that's something that you're going to need to engage with them on and understand what their position is, and also help them to understand what your position is and where you would wish to go in an ideal world. Next slide, please, Karen. Taking a principal authority perspective, and I think it probably is, they're dealing with huge issues of, well, dissolution for all of them, irrespective of who the continuing authority is, completely different ways of working, political and administrative challenges. For them, when they're looking at assets and services, it's probably relatively straightforward. There are different ways of categorizing them, but this is a fairly commonly used one. There are strategic assets that they're going to hold. Realistically, those are going to be things like land designated for development. Those things are likely to stay with the principal authority, and they're likely to transfer to the new authority. The clue's in the title. They're considered to be strategic assets. They sit at a higher level than any one community. Operational assets are those which are needed for the exercise and discharge of a function. They are the sort of things, depending on what that function is, depending on what the future of the function is, and depending on whether or not that function is a statutory duty or it's a power, whether it's discretionary, they may or may not be capable of coming our way. But again, because they are needed for operational purchases, they are probably less likely to. Income generating assets, and especially those which generate a surplus or a profit if you're in the private sector, things like car parks, investment properties, realistically, they are highly likely to stay with the principal authority and to transfer over to the unitary authority. It doesn't mean there won't be cases that can't be made for them to be transferred, but I think that's going to be a harder ask unless there are specific circumstances where you can find a real win-win situation for both principal authority, town or parish council, and the community that they represent. And no surprise, spoiler alert, surplus to requirements, these are the sorts of assets which are most likely to be made available. Some of those will be community buildings, which may cost quite a bit to maintain. Some will be a blend, perhaps, between the operational and surplus to requirements. So public convenience is a classic example. Is it that the building surplus to requirements because you're withdrawing from providing public conveniences, or the other way around? It doesn't matter, but that's the kind of area that you're looking at there. Turning to services, of course, a principal authority's got two types of services, those which are statutory and which has got a duty in order to deliver. That's things like library services, highways, children's services. They may have an option as to how they reconfigure those services, but they don't have an option to not deliver those services. So again, that means that they will continue to be responsible for that. Whereas discretionary services, things like leisure, public conveniences, if they wish to, they can stop doing tomorrow, subject to whatever contractual or other arrangements that they may have in place. And those are the services which are typically most likely to be looked at in any devolution package. Again, income generating services fall into the same category as income generating assets, unlikely to be devolved, and those which run at a cost and are discretionary are the ones which are highly likely to either be withdrawn or offered to town and parish councils, or which town and parish councils might want to step in and replace. Understanding what business the principal authority is in, its priorities and its pressures is probably central to this. If you look across most local authorities, whether they're principal authorities or town and parish councils, they have areas that they focus on. They are known for doing some things well, not that they don't do other things well, but they have a particular focus, and that's driven by their communities, driven by the politics and the place that they represent. And understanding that might actually help you to understand what is or isn't achievable from a practical point of view. The other thing I think, which is really important, is helping them to understand what your priorities and critical timelines are time and time again, and it doesn't matter where you go in the country where devolution has happened, the same thing gets said, which is the principal authority came along and said, we're getting rid of these assets or these services, and they came to us at the end of February, and we'd already set our budget. And we couldn't do it, but they said it's going to be effective from the 1st of April because that's the timeline they're working to. Getting them to understand your budget setting timeline, um, and your priorities will help them to actually help you, because it doesn't matter if you want to do it and if you can do it. If you haven't raised the funds for it, you aren't going to be able to. No surprises approach, and very much a partnering and a two-way process. Next slide, please, Karen. So before we move on from the conceptual side of things, there's probably a sense check. We've talked about uncertainties. We've talked about the fact that some town and parish councils may have clear aspirations and want to be early adopters, that some may not want to go there at all. But we need to be thinking, I guess, about at a very preliminary level, are there things that we could be doing, things that we should be doing? And before we go into the due diligence around it, is there actually anything that our council needs or wants? Now, there will be some areas where there is a very long list there. There'll be some areas where you could have a rural parish where actually there are no public conveniences. The services are all statutory. There aren't any burial grounds which are run by the principal authority, no allotments, no play areas that are run by them. It's going to be, broadly speaking, business as usual. The relationship with the principal authority will change, but actually in terms of asset and service devolution, it may be very different. Equally, if you look at some of the larger settlements, the towns, you could have dramatic impacts. And we've seen that in Somerset, and we'll come on to some of those examples later. The last bullet point looks a little bit trite: representative democracy, your council, your choice. That's actually there for a reason, and it's there to really highlight the fact that some councils will come under pressure. They'll come under pressure from their communities. They'll come under pressure from their principal councils to take something, to do something, to deliver something. And at the end of the day, just like your principal councils, your statutory bodies constituted under the Local Government Act 1972, ultimately, it is your choice. You are a representative council. We don't exist in a participative democracy. It's representative. It is about you deciding what your community needs and what you need to do, whilst being accountable to your community for the decisions that you take. Ultimately, there are going to be difficult choices for a lot of communities coming out of local government reorganisation. And you are going to have to moderate, mediate, and deliver what you think is best for your community, having done that initial due diligence, which is, do we need or want anything? If we do, what's the timing of that? How do we go about doing it? And what are the consequences? And consequences are upsides, but they're downsides too. Next slide, please, Karen. There are, though, some things that we can do now which are not resource intensive or don't have to be resource intensive, which is by way of baselining, I guess. Thinking about your resources, some of which you, in inverted commas, own, and they're listed there in terms of various plans and documents that you may or may not have. Some of those are going to be very specific to your community. Some of those might be rather more general. There's one which always gets forgotten about, and in the context of LGR, I'm going to flag, and that's your risk register. Dust it off, take it out, review it, and begin to keep it up to date, because unless you're expecting there to be no impacts from reorganisation, then that risk register will become a dynamic document, and it will be something which will become a key part of your decision-making processes. It may, of course, be the case that your principal authorities will have a range of information, right the way down through from things like deprivation indices for your area, which the county council will have, through to a range of strategies, policies, plans, and initiatives. So take the opportunity, if you can, to review those and to see whether or not there are any messages which are coming out of that. If you've got some of these documents, do you need to amend or update them? Some of them may or may not still be in time, but equally, do you need to create new resources in the context of where we're going? And outside of what your principal authority has got and what you've got, are there other resources that you need to identify and access in order to be able to move your thinking forwards? And that really ties into what you're going to need to make a decision. I've talked about a reality check there and thinking about appetite and capacity. And I guess sort of two examples came to my mind when I thought of that. One of which worked out and one of which didn't work out. So if I use my own community as an example, in 1913, the Duke of Bedford, who'd owned most of Tavistock at that time, decided to dispose of his interests in the town. The predecessor council to my council in 1913 then raised a loan of, well, in order to meet a bill of £35,000 in order to acquire those assets. That was a significant sum of money at that time, and it was absolutely a leap of faith in terms of investing, if you like, in the future of the town. As it's happened, most of those assets still sit with the town council, and it has been an investment which has paid itself many times over in terms of maintaining and developing, if you like, the heritage aspect of the town, keeping historic buildings, but keeping the retail centre a vibrant centre and keeping Tavistock as a market town. That very definitely worked out, even though there was a considerable risk involved. In the alternative, a few years ago, I was up the line and I was speaking to a town council which had taken over a building for £1 from their principal authority. And they were saying, and they'd taken it over within the previous 10 years. And they were saying, we've just got to get rid of this building. It's costing us a shed load of money. And it's going to cost us in excess of £200,000 to get rid of it. And I said, I don't understand how that can be. And they said, well, it's got dry rot, it's got structural issues, we've got to replace parts of the roof, it's got a sitting tenant under an agreement, which means that it's almost impossible to get rid of the sitting tenant. It's got very onerous covenants in terms of what it can be used for, and in effect, it has no open market value. To which my response was, well, what on earth was your surveyor doing when they surveyed it and they didn't spot those issues? Oh, we didn't use a surveyor because it came from the principal authority. Right. Well, what on earth was your solicitor doing when they actually looked at the clauses in the covenants which applied to it? Well, we didn't use a solicitor because we didn't need to, because the principal authority prepared all the documentation. All we needed to do was ask members to agree to sign it. There, something was taken on trust, and I've got no reason to believe that the principal authority in any way was trying to do anything than dispose of a surplus asset which was significant cost bearing. But the point was, they didn't do their due diligence, they didn't employ and engage professionals, and they didn't take appropriate advice and then have regard to it. So you're spending a lot of money maintaining something, you're then spending a lot of money disposing of something, because they also didn't have a business plan for what it was going to be used for. Basically, they said, it's going to be disposed of. We don't know how it's going to be disposed of. It's a community building and we need to take it. And I think there's a real danger zone story in that, about thinking about our due diligence in terms of what we do and how, and that links into having objectives which are smart, objectives which are specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time bound in whatever it is that we do. Next slide, please, Karen. Turning then to the sort of tools that we might use. SWOT and Pestle are tools of very long standing. They've been around for, well, certainly the last 40 years since I did my qualifications, but they are simple, but they are helpful, and at times they are powerful. SWOT tends to be an organizational analysis tool. I suspect all your councils have used them, looking at your strengths, your weaknesses, the opportunities and threats that face you. But it's a very useful way of getting a conversation going and beginning to think about how you actually identify those and what you consider to be the most important within them. Pestle is a environmental analysis tool, but it can also be used as a risk analysis tool. I'm sorry it doesn't come out very well, but there is a link to the Charity Commission website that you can click on there, and that's a one page about how it can be used for risk analysis. I think the one thing I would say in relation to the Pestle analysis is, for the purposes of local government reorganisation and community assets and community services, I would actually add community into that. It is in part picked up through some of the other categories, but really getting a focus on community can be helpful. Next slide, please, Karen. So we've looked at our policies and our processes. What can we do next? Well, there's something which is about baselining or auditing what our principal authorities actually do have in the community, whether those are assets or services. If we start with assets, both your principal authority and the county council should have its asset register online. Don't rely on it being up to date. I can think of an asset register here, I won't say which authorities, where at least two of the things which are on it have been disposed of. But it's a good start point in terms of understanding what they've got and where, and with a bit of luck, it will also show you what they hold freehold and what they hold under leases within that area. In terms of the services, that's something where, from your local knowledge, from speaking to your county and your district councillors, and from your experience and from the groups that you're linked in with, then identifying what those services are, but don't just think narrowly in terms of those which are solely delivered by. There will be other means of delivery. So, for example, libraries are the responsibility of Devon County Council, but they're delivered by, I think, Devon Libraries Together, which is a charitable organisation. So there may be other ways in which those services are delivered, and don't leave those out. Beyond that, it's understanding whether or not those are actually at risk, because if they're not at risk, depending on your appetite, you may or you may not want to actually engage in that. Again, we've talked about understanding principal authorities and their priorities, and doing nothing, either at this stage or at a future stage, is an option, but it's only an option if you've made a conscious decision. And so what I would say is, don't do nothing without actually thinking about what the consequences of that are, but it's a perfectly valid decision otherwise. Next slide, please, Karen. Of course, when you come to look at assets and services, and I think in particular for services, as I mentioned earlier, think about what some of those less direct impacts might actually be. It's not just about boots on the ground, and there's a list there of other ways in which your principal, and I'm sure there's plenty of others, in which your principal authority can make a difference. Is it offering grant schemes or providing other financial assistance? So, for example, if you're a town, if your principal authority is offering or awarding £10,000 a year to the local Citizens Advice Bureau, that's not a service that they're delivering, but it might be a service which is critically dependent upon the financial assistance they're giving. Things like information, guidance, and similar support, very often you will find that support is given to businesses or to particular groups in the community in terms of advice and information, help and support, either on an ongoing basis or at particular times. Sometimes services are provided in kind or below cost. Very often, officers of the principal authority will assist town and parish councils in terms of some initiatives, and there is no cost which is associated with that. But they may be doing that for other groups and organisations as well. Events and activities, Here, our Tavistock Goose Fair is a partnership between us and the Borough Council. There will be a host of other events and activities that will be supported by each of your principal authorities. They go below the radar, but what happens if a new unitary authority isn't actually going to be delivering those? Is that something that you could step in on or not? Things like potentially even Christmas lights would fall into that category. Partnerships, that's the power of convening in many ways, I guess, that principal authorities have. Certainly, I can think of two of my council's major initiatives within the town, which flowed out of a partnership grouping of heritage and business interests, which was set up by the principal authority. Only they could probably have set that up. We developed, designed, and delivered those projects. But would they have happened without that group being convened in the first place and the network of links that the principal authority actually had? They probably couldn't have happened without that. So it's thinking outside the box, and whatever other forms of indirect support or assistance there may be, which, unless and until they go, aren't really on the radar as being a service which is being delivered, but they might be an impact that you decide you need to step into or not. Could we go to the next slide, please, Karen? Right, my apologies for this one, because this is the geeky bit in terms of where we are and the legal position, which is really, in a way, should we do it and can we do it? As we all know, we have powers and duties as town and parish councils. Broadly speaking, our only duty is the provision of allotments. Everything else is done under a power. In either case, power or duty is conferred by statute. If there's no statutory power or a duty, if it isn't in the law, there is no authority to act, and the council is open to challenging any decision it makes by judicial review. Now, there are some exceptions and some mitigations, if you like. One of the mitigations is under Section 111 of the Local Government Act 1972, which says if the unauthorized, as in there isn't an explicit statutory authorization action, is calculated to facilitate or is conducive or incidental to the discharge of any of your functions, then you can actually use that to support the function you're delivering. So if you ever wondered how a council can buy paper clips because there isn't a bit of legislation that says they can, that's the bit that we'll buy that sort of thing under. But that is limited to doing the things that you already have authority to do. It's also important to recognise, I think, as a baseline, that Section 101 of the Local Government Act 1972 is very specific in terms of who can make decisions on behalf of your council. In short, it can be done by the council, by a joint committee, it can be done by a committee, a subcommittee, exercising delegated authority from the council, or an officer exercising delegated authority. There aren't any other ways. You can't have the chairman and the vice chairman making a decision. You can't have the clerk making a decision when the authority hasn't been delegated to them. Working groups, other informal arrangements, panels, whatever you want to call them, unless they meet the criteria of being a committee or a subcommittee, unless they're a council or an officer and there's a clear delegation, there are no facilities for making decisions. And as we go through this process, I think it's really helpful to think about how we make our decisions, who makes them, and setting that out first. And we'll come on to that a bit more later. What if the council has got the general power of competence? Surely that cures all. Well, in broad terms, the general power of competence enables the council to do something an individual could do, which does sound like it cures all the issues. But, and it's a big but, there are limitations on the general power of competence and how it operates. In particular, there are restrictions in place which apply where previously limitations have been set by other legislation. So if you take the example of councillors' allowances, there is lots of town and parish councils don't pay a basic allowance to councillors, but you have an authority to do so under a statutory instrument. The difficulty is if you then wanted to use the general power of competence to say, well, The statutory instrument says you can only pay to elected councillors, but we want to pay co-optees. The statutory instrument doesn't mention that you can't pay co-optees, but it's a pre-commencement limitation for the purposes of the general power of competence. Because it said who you can pay, by definition, anybody else can't be paid the basic allowance. And when you think how many pieces of legislation there are which potentially relate to how things are done in our sector, then the general power of competence always has to be tested against the legislation that applies to the area that you're looking to take over. And that's particularly an issue in relation to services. So please don't think of the general power of competence as being a get out of jail free card. Beyond that, there is an interesting and I should say unresolved debate in the sector, which is about the extent to which a town or parish council can exercise a statutory duty of a principal council. As I say, it's unresolved. It's one for another day. The consensus seems to be going that you can do it under contractual arrangements, but you certainly can't deliver their statutory duty because only they can actually deliver it. So you need to also think about, if a duty is coming your way, the mechanism by which it is coming, whether that's through a contract or through some other form of contractual or equivalent arrangement, and what you do and how you do it. Having conducted that piece of due diligence, that leads us to the 4 questions in the 4th bullet point. Is it something outside of our powers? If it's wholly outside our powers, we can't do it. But can it be brought within? And if so, how? So, for example, I understand that a parish or town council cannot operate vehicle-activated speed signs unless it has a delegation from the highway authority which enables it to do so. Secondly, does it require special arrangements? So the classic one there is probably trading activities. Whether you're a town council, a parish council, or a principal authority, you do not have a legal right to embark on trading activities for trading purposes. In other words, trading for profit, in effect. However, you can set up arm's length companies or other equivalent approved vehicles which enable you to trade through those. And that's why you very often see a separation between, if you like, the commissioning arm in a highways authority and the delivery arm, which will be set up at arm's length so that it can conduct work for other authorities and other agencies. Thirdly, is it something which is in power but is actually regulated, and therefore you have to comply with those regulations? So car parks, probably the classic one there. We are able to operate car parks, but the Transparency Code and other legislation sets out how we must apply and account for the income which we receive in relation to that. And finally, are there areas which actually we can't do because they're precluded? So even if you've got a car park, one of the things that we can't do is we cannot do car park enforcement. That's just precluded. However, we can engage an organisation which is authorised to do that, to do it for and on our behalf. And again, that comes back to what we touched on earlier, which is about the professional advice you might need, the stages that you need it at, and the contingencies that you have in place. And I guess, although no one wants something to fail, going back to my example, which was about the building which had been acquired from a principal authority and was now going to be disposed of, do we actually have an exit strategy? And what does that need to include? Because if you've taken on services, that exit strategy may include things like the contractual arrangements for your staff, but it might actually also include the customers or the clients who are affected by the type of service that you're delivering, as well as other stakeholders. And equally, if we decide not to proceed, I've said about a rebuttal strategy. I think that's more about a communication strategy. How are we going to articulate either what we do or what we don't do? And then the final bullet point, the why, what, when, who, how. I think really I wanted to focus there upon thinking about your internal arrangements. If you're going to start having a conversation about local government reorganisation, is that going to be in full meetings of the council? Formal? Is it going to be in informal meetings? Are they going to be open to the public? Are they going to be closed? Do you want the opportunity to think the unthinkable and speak the unspeakable with one another as you actually refine what you're doing? In which case, if you're doing that in the public domain, that could set in train a whole series of events and a world of pain. Equally, at some point, you do want to be open and transparent about what you're doing and how. That balance is going to be something that you're going to have to set in terms of your own circumstances and your own position. And neither route is right or wrong. At times, both can have their merits. But think about how you actually want to do that before you start off having a very public conversation, and all of a sudden people are saying, well, the council's going to do this, 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 and this, when you're only at the preliminary stage. Some of you will be beyond that already, and I appreciate that. And I guess there's also a question which is around either your what I call twin or triple hatters. If you've got councillors who serve on your council, who also serve on the district, possibly also the county, or the district and the county, as the case may be, how are you actually going to manage that? Now, there probably isn't a interest arising under the code of conduct in relation to those, but my goodness gracious me, there could be a point of commercial interest. In the case of my own council, we've agreed that those members will be involved throughout the process until we get to commercially sensitive negotiating points. And if we do get to those, they've agreed that they will take a step out of the decision-making process in relation to that. It doesn't matter what arrangements you come up with. It matters probably that you think now at the start about what you're going to do, when and how, because that's your opportunity to do it before the heat, if you like, of the issue comes into play. Could we move on to the next slide, please? So here's really a list of questions. I'm not intending to go through it beyond referencing the point around, is it urgent? Is it important? Is it a priority? Ultimately, if everything's a priority, nothing will be. It's about very much identifying what are the things that would be at the top of your list and why, and then reflecting on some of the other points that we've got there, some of which we've already checked against. And again, developing and testing the narrative. That's how you get to a balanced decision as to what you're going to do. It's how the public understand and your community understands what you're doing and not doing. It's how your principal authority understands that. And it's about how your business case itself is in fact actually developed. And critically, through the conversations with your principal authority and your own appetite, understanding, are you working to that pre-LGR time frame or after, or a mix of the two? Next slide, please. And then this one is starting to pull the information together. If you've adopted an evidence-led process, then balancing that against the political imperative that you have in your community, ascertaining what your council wants and needs and what your community wants and needs. Now, in theory, what your council and community want and need are going to be exactly the same thing. But I think we've all got experience where those things divert, and there is a decision to be made if there is a difference between those as to what you do and how you communicate. And that leads into the conversation around what the impacts of delivery potentially are, and thinking then about what those means of delivery are and what it is you're actually talking about. So if you're talking, let's just use libraries as an example. If it was a library, would you be delivering the library service? Would you be taking on the premises, but would another agent be actually delivering that service itself? So under a contract, would you have a concession? Would you have a lease? What would the arrangements themselves actually be? That's the end of the first part, which is the longest part, you'll be pleased to know. Are there any questions on that so far before we move on to the more detailed part? I don't know, Karen or Rebecca, if there's anything in the chat which has come up in particular on that side.
No questions in the chat, no.
Got you. In which case, can we move to the next slide? So having reviewed the environment, understanding the potential risks and benefits and taking that preliminary view, we've got the opportunity now for a more detailed piece of work. The first thing to say is, and we've touched on this in relation to the asset register, please don't assume that your principal authority is going to have detailed records. Please don't assume it's going to have accurate records, whether that's about the cost of what's delivered and how, whether that's about surveys, inspections, registers. They may have, but it may be patchy. In some cases, they will only have information about services on a district-wide basis. Understand whether or not the information they do give you is robust. So are they actually just doing an apportionment for what they think a service costs in your area, or are they doing something different? From your point of view, the most important thing you can do is your business case. I mean, we've talked about business plans, feasibility studies, whatever else. Some things aren't going to need that, but everything is going to need a business case, even if it's half a side of A4, which says we want to do this because, and we've thought about the cost and the benefits, and this is how we're going to do it. So however you do it, that is the narrative that you're building. That is what shows to your principal authority that you're credible. It's what shows to your community you're credible, and what enables you to test your thinking against the implications of what you're doing. I'm not going to go through the risk, but I will make some specific references on the budget and the funding side of things. Please bear in mind that if you have monies which you hold as a capital reserve, or if you have a capital receipt, or if you are seeking Public Works Loan Board funding, those are not capable of being used for revenue to fund revenue purposes. Unlike government, which can borrow in order to fund revenue, we can't, and those are strict obligations in terms of us. But also think about whether or not there is a dowry which could come with something, whether or not something, if it's a set of public conveniences and you're going to take them on, can you actually persuade the local authority, the principal authority, to actually do some repair work, to do make good before it actually transfers? Think about things like that. And also, we probably need to bear in mind that whatever funds there are from government, which might potentially be accessible, in almost all cases, they can only be accessed via a principal authority. Government still has a standing rule, which is in most cases, government monies cannot be accessed directly by town and parish councils. Things like historic income and expenditure from the principal authority, treat with caution for the reasons that I've given, but also think about how you're going to schedule your spend, because there's going to be things you need to do before taking on something, during and after, and actually that cash flow is something that you're going to need to think about. Can we go to the next slide, please, Karen? So again, just a schedule of things to have a think about in terms of where you're at. I think the one that I would particularly pull out of that is professional services. Think about when you need them, what you're going to need. PID stands for Professional Indemnity Insurance. It's really important to have the right advice, and the bigger your project is, the more important that is. And going to the right advisor will make a difference, but also the fact they've got professional indemnity insurance means if things do go catastrophically wrong, if you've been misadvised, you do have some redress. Please don't rely upon a public-spirited member of the public, a public-spirited counsellor, to actually provide you with professional advice. By all means, use them to test the professional advice that you've received, but bear in mind, if a counsellor is giving you that advice, almost certainly they aren't doing it on a contractual basis. Their professional indemnity insurance isn't going to be engaged. And if things do go wrong or complications arise, it is going to be very, very difficult to actually manage that when the advice you have received is from someone inside the organization and a politician, because the challenge is always going to be, yes, but. So by all means, use the expertise you have in-house to test the professional guidance that you receive, but please separate professional expertise from the political and community leadership role that you have as councillors. There are other resources which are available, such as Devon Association of Local Councils, Devon Communities Together, Locality, Society of Local Council Clerks, and others. All of them provide services which could potentially assist you in this process. Some of them are at a charge, but think about whether or not external advice and guidance is useful, and think about your partners. Could we go to the next slide, please? This is just a list of services. We're going to start on services before moving on to assets. You'll recognize many of those. It's not an exhaustive list. There will be services which your principal authorities are delivering which aren't on this list. There'll be things on this list which some of your principal authorities may not actually be delivering. You may be delivering, or they may not actually be within your community. It's really only there to say there is a wide range of things that can come your way, and there's a wide range of things that impact upon your community that you might want to have in your mind as we go forward and as you start to scope things. Next slide, please, Karen. Turning then to how services are delivered. Well, we touched earlier upon direct delivery, and typically that will be when something comes to you because it's scheduled for withdrawal by a principal authority. Back in 2012, there was an initiative led by Devon County Council and where Tavistock Town Council and West Devon Borough Council were partners, which started looking at other ways in which local service delivery could be influenced as part of the then localism agenda of the government at the time, which probably goes to show that there isn't anything new under the sun. But there are other ways than direct service delivery. Delegation of a service is something where the principal authority retains control, but you take it on, perhaps, or another body could take it on under a service level agreement or a memorandum of understanding. Contractual arrangements, where you're actually awarded a contract either through procurement, a standard procurement exercise, or sometimes there are exceptions basis within procurement contracts. So my council at one time had a 10% of the West Devon grounds maintenance budget, which was awarded on an exception basis for several years. There are service top-ups where maybe the principal authority has a universal standard and you can pay for an extra service, or alternatively where they've effectively withdrawn a service, but you're paying a top-up for them to come back in and to deliver that on an agreed basis. There is the potential for joint use agreements. Those tend to be under a specific piece of part of the 1972 Act for things like the Tamar Bridge Committee. So they tend not to be with town and parish councils, but they can be. So if you've got a big devolution aspect going on, that's something which you can look at. And of course, there's influencing, which is very much about your role as leaders of place and people in your communities, working with the principal authorities around service performance and service configuration in your area. There's the opportunity for parishes to come together to cluster, to build their resources, or to partner with other organisations and other community groups in terms of what can be done and how. Facilitating includes things like maybe providing premises, maybe providing grants or other assistance. And there are bespoke vehicles like community interest companies, arm's length companies, charities, etc., which can be set up in order to deliver on certain outputs should you wish to do so. Next slide, please, Karen. Turning then to the list of bullet points here, means of current delivery. Think about, as we said before, is it being delivered in-house under external contracts? And think about how you would deliver it in the future. Would it be the same way as that principal authority, or would you deliver it differently? And what are the benefits and drawbacks of that? When you're looking at staff, there's a host of stuff, but think about the numbers, the disposition of those staff, the scope of the service that's being offered, the training they need, other needs that are associated with that. Legal requirements, it's a minefield, isn't it? You know, you've got transfer of undertakings or TUPE legislation. You're almost certainly going to have local government pension scheme expertise required. You may have to look at value added tax, job harmonization, evaluation. There will be some things which are specific to individual services because of the nature of the services that are being delivered. So independent professional advice, and you might need different advisors on different ones of those topics, depending on the scale of what you're doing, may be necessary. And please don't think anything is too small. I was surprised to find when we changed our cleaning contract, which was an external cleaner coming in, doing, I think, about 6.5 hours a week, TUPE applied in relation to that. So depending on how things are configured, there can be issues and implications for you there. And of course, costs, they can be direct, indirect, they can be fixed, they can be variable, they can be on costs, and they can relate to various aspects of the service that's being delivered. Again, work your way through those. And I guess critically, again, think about what's currently being paid so far as you can ascertain it and what it's going to cost you. Don't just use the district council or county council's cost base from your point of view. We've touched on funding. Insurance, I'm going to say this, some of these are going to be the same in assets. Don't forget insurance, whatever you do. Service standards, are they set? Are they set by law? Are they statutory? Are they discretionary? Are they contractual? Are they governed by membership of a particular body or a particular service type organization? Are they down to local choice? Understand what your obligations would be in terms of the standard of service and the discretion you do or don't have. And I'd say in particular, I think, when you're looking at funding services, there will be some services in your community which are currently being funded by either community infrastructure levy or Section 106 monies. If those services are coming to you and those monies continue to exist, they haven't been fully drawn down, there is absolutely a discussion to be had with your principal authority about funding following function. Why would they keep the money which has been hypothecated to a service which you're going to be delivering in the future? So just bear that in mind just in case. And of course, procurement law compliance, if you're effectively buying into a contract, is something you're going to need to think about. And then there's a host of other requirements which are going to come into play. I guess you're almost certainly going to end up having to do equality impact assessments, but things like collective bargaining, staff training, safe systems of work, onboarding of staff, and thinking about the contractual regularization of what you do and how are going to be at least some of those. And that really means we've got to start thinking about what the capacity to deliver is. Bearing in mind that for a modest sized parish council, taking on 2 members of staff could be just as impactful as a larger council taking on 20. Next slide, please. Moving then to assets from services. Again, this is just a list. It's not an exhaustive list, and assets will vary from area to area depending on where you are. Can we move to the next slide, please, Karen? So from a legal point of view, assets, if they're going to come to you, fall into 2 types of transfer. Those which are classified as disposals and those which aren't. So for disposals, they're listed there. A disposal is either a freehold transfer to a town or parish council or a long lease, which is classed as being over 7 years. Disposals are regulated under statute, in particular recognising that councils are publicly funded bodies and they're obliged to seek best consideration. Now, typically there are then 2 areas you have to look at in disposals which relate to the size. If it's a disposal of over £2 million value, then, and there aren't going to be many of those, the Secretary of State's consent is required. So let's park those and assume that there aren't going to be many of those. If it's under that value, in general terms, the principal authority is under an obligation to achieve best consideration. And of course, what that means, not necessarily market price, but it does mean that a transfer at a reduced amount isn't possible. There is, however, a mechanism which is available called the General Disposal Consent 2003. And what that does is it provides a set of criteria which enables a principal authority to dispose at a lesser value should it wish to do so. And that relies upon the disposal being of a value of less than 2 million. It has to be assessed by a suitably qualified surveyor according to what are called Red Book rules and principles. And it has to be something which demonstrates in the view of the principal authority that there's economic, social, or environmental benefit. And that enables a disposal at less than best consideration to take place. I know some principal authorities in the early days were saying, for example, we can't dispose of a car park because it would be at less than best consideration and the law doesn't allow us to. Well, the law does allow you to, provided you go through that process, provided the surveyor assessment is consistent with the rules, and provided they wish to do so. It doesn't mean they won't ask for a consideration, but it does mean that you have an avenue should you and they both wish to proceed for disposal of a lease of over 7 years or freehold transfer. Next slide, please, Karen. That takes us on then to non-disposals, leases of under 7 years, licenses or other management arrangements. And broadly speaking, that can be however you and the principal authority actually wish to do it. They aren't governed in the same way in terms of a non-disposal. It can be a much more flexible arrangement. And of course, it might be the case that one of your options is to look at a lease or a short-term lease or a license arrangement as a tester, for lack of a better way of putting it, of an arrangement which might in the future then move towards being a disposal, but you will have trialed it to see whether or not it actually works. I should say some authorities may actually already have a community asset transfer policy. Have a look at it and see to what extent it is something which, for community assets, you might decide that you want to you want to progress under an existing policy. And of course, there are other mechanisms, although your principal authority might see these as hostile, seeking to designate an asset of community value in order to protect it. But of course, all that does is protect it for 6 months against disposal at a market rate. And it's fair to say that principal authorities tend to be reluctant to designate their own assets as being of community value, in fairness. Next slide, please. We talked earlier about what assets might be. I would say if you do nothing else, if you are thinking seriously about assets, put in place an asset acquisition and disposal policy for your council. I know some councils in Devon have already done this and that work's underway, but something which documents for you the process that you would undertake in terms of acquiring or indeed disposing of, but for the purpose of this exercise, acquiring an asset. And speak to your principal authorities about whether or not they have got a document acquisition and disposal policy. Because if they do have, that will set out what their current policy is. And it will also tell you, or it'll give you a reality check, if you like, as to whether or not some of your aspirations potentially can be met or not, as the case may be. Turning then to some of the other factors on the list, condition, the condition of premises, what's the historic maintenance and inspection records, the cost we've talked about. Have they got the asbestos register? Are there prior condition surveys in relation to it? Contaminated land surveys? What statutory inspections and checks have been made? Are there some things which are going to be location specific? I know Tavistock is an absolute nightmare as a former mining area in terms of contaminated land. That's an issue for us in everything from burial grounds through to properties. It may not be an issue in your area, but you may have something else which is an issue. So understand what those complications potentially could be. You'll all be familiar with the planning conditions and restrictions that might go with particular buildings and use classes. But there are other factors. And, you know, it's not just about the value and use that those factors could impact, but you know, are there things around arrangements for access? Are there sitting tenants, vendor overage or reversion clauses? How are improvements to the property going to be treated? Covenants, easements, other rights of way? Are the leases contracted in or out of the Law of Property Act 1925 in terms of security of tenure provisions for tenants? Dilapidations, repairing obligations, rights to renew, reversion clauses, service charges. And then when you've gone through all of that, and it is a lot, think about, are these things which currently apply to the premises? In other words, things which almost certainly will transfer to you and you have no choice or discretion in? Or are they things which the principal authority is itself actually introducing? Because they can form part of a negotiation, because those things are only there because the district or the county council is saying we want them there, not because they have to transfer with the property. And are those acceptable to you, and are they onerous? And I would say from experience, look particularly at overage and reversion clauses in relation to freehold transfers, and dilapidation requirements and the treatment of improvements in relation to leases, because those are the sorts of areas where you can get caught out. Repairing obligations on leases can be very, very significant. So that's why it's so important to do your own due diligence with professionals who represent you and your interests, and think about the business plan that you're actually going to have. If you are going out to seek other funding, whether that's Precept, Public Works Loan Board, think about what the timelines are for that funding and how long it might actually take you to get that, and be prepared to act in advance. Next slide, please. Several of these criteria are actually taken from a report in the public interest, which was done a few years ago in relation to a town council in Devon taking on a town hall. And it is a helpful checklist, I think, in terms of some of the must-dos. So having a surveyor's structural and condition survey of the premises, but also having an insurance valuation so you meaningfully can insure it and understand it. Legal services, listening to the advice that you're receiving, undertaking the searches, looking at the documentation, understanding exactly what it is you're receiving. Is there other professional advice you're going to need? Mechanical and engineering, finance, heritage, depending on the kind of premises that you're going to take on, depending on the kind of use it's going to be put to, those things can all change and change dramatically. Are you required to consult, or is consultation desirable? And if so, at what stage in the process are you going to do it? We touched on earlier, being clear which part of the council can make decisions. Don't have decisions made by accident. It needs to be very clear to all members when that decision is going to be made and how that decision is going to be made. Thinking about things like the associated costs, business rates, insurance, your utilities and services, but also VAT. It may or may not be relevant whether or not you wish to opt to tax the building for VAT purposes, depending on what you're going to use it for. And these things are best thought about in advance. As with services, you may, depending on use, need to do an equality impact assessment. And is there a refurbishment or an improvement that the transferring authority could make, or a dowry that could potentially go with it, or something by way of improvements or repairs? That's the end of the second part. Are there any questions coming from that you've had, Karen or Rebecca?
Again, nothing in the chat.
Right, folks. It's only 3 slides. It's okay. Part 3. This is very much sort of concluding in terms of where we're at. It's drawing things together, and now that you've got all the information, it's a step forward from the first part of this presentation, which is really starting to say, we now know the things that are there. We've looked at our policies, we've looked at our community, we've looked at our needs and our wants. Does it actually sit best with us? The principle of subsidiarity. What is the most local level this appropriately sits at? And is it something which in practice is best delivered by us, or are there other ways of delivering it, or other partners who could deliver it? It might be that if you were doing something in relation to children's services for the sake of argument, that you decided, well, we can provide the premises and we can provide the finance for it, but actually we need to engage this particular children's charity or other group in order to be able to deliver the service itself, and we have to fund them to do it because we don't have the skills, the knowledge, or the expertise in order to be able to do it ourselves. You may have different views, but I think my council's fundamental view is if there's only one question to ask, it's does it protect or enhance important, valued, and relevant community assets and services? That's what we've used as our underlying principle in terms of the discussions that have taken place here. But you will have your own views as to what that might be. Again, it's about that narrative and understanding really why you're doing things and being able to justify it to yourself and to others. Factors like community capacity and resilience, you will have your own factors that you wish to come up with. The one thing I haven't touched on up till now, but I think it's really important that we recognise is our services in large part are funded by the ratepayer, the precept payer, and so are principal authority services. Now, there is a view which is taken in many cases around something called double taxation, which is, well, if the principal authority is delivering something which costs £25,000 a year and it stops doing that and it passes it to you, and you have to raise your precept by 25,000, but it doesn't reduce its council tax, then actually the member of the public or the ratepayer is being taxed twice for the same service. Now, whether that's good or bad, that does happen from time to time. But I guess in terms of our discussions with principal authorities, whether it's the outgoing districts or the incoming unitary authority, what are the things that we can do in order to either make that cost neutral, in other words, something which isn't going to cost the taxpayer more? That's probably unlikely, to be fair, looking at the experience elsewhere. But can we actually reduce that 25,000 from 25,000 to something else? That might be about a transfer of some income, either an income generating asset or an income stream from the principal authority by way of a partial subsidy in relation to that. Or it might be about looking at, for the larger communities, a package-based approach. The difficulty is if you do one asset at a time, one service at a time, you don't necessarily know at the start where you're going to end up. But equally, if you can put together a package, then that might be something where you can show and understand the overall benefits and the overall drawbacks. And that can be as simple as, and I'll use a very simple example, if you've got a set of public conveniences in a car park which is costing £25,000 a year to run, small parish council says, my goodness, we couldn't possibly take that on at that kind of cost, but if you can give us this number of parking bays, or alternatively this income stream, which let's say is £15,000 a year, then actually we can fund 10,000 and we can keep those toilets open. The principal authority is saving £10,000 a year. The community isn't paying the full cost going forward. It's a simple example and it's a simplistic example, but it's about ways of finding acceptable means to benefit the public and not disadvantage, because this isn't a win-lose situation in terms of our negotiations with the principal authority. It's about winning for each authority and winning for the ratepayer, I would suggest. And that comes back to partnering, no surprises, and thinking about what the legacy that you want from your council to be. Going back to those burghers of Tavistock Town Council, in 1913, they have a living legacy today, which benefits the people of the town. What do you want your legacy to be as a council, and how do you actually wish to frame that? Because that is a matter which is very much in your gift. And next slide, please, Karen. Now, I appreciate this very much focuses on larger communities, so it's not going to be representative of what necessarily might or might not happen in Devon, but I think it's helpful just to look at what the scale can be and what those impacts are. And so if I just give you an indicative example, when I came to Tavistock in using Cornwall as a reference point, there was probably one council in Cornwall which had a larger budget than Tavistock Town Council. 15 years on from devolution in Cornwall, and Tavistock Town Council hasn't shrunk in terms of size. It's grown organically in the same way as most councils in Devon have. 15 years on, within 2 years, there will be between 12 and 14 councils in Cornwall which have a larger budget than Tavistock Town Council. And if you look at the impacts in Somerset, where essentially because of a financial crisis in the principal authority, the unitary, devolution happened much faster, you can see exponential growth in terms of councils like Yeovil and Bridgewater. Now, I appreciate that with the exception of Exmouth, we don't have any settlements in Devon which are their size, but we absolutely do have councils in Devon the size of places like Camborne and Falmouth. And as I said at the start, even if you're a smaller council and you look at those figures and say, well, they don't relate to us, actually, if you don't have anything at the moment, taking on a play area, taking on some public conveniences, a cemetery, these can be significant in terms of their impact. If your precept is £500 a year, and certainly I know in the area where I live, 3 or 4 councils which precept less than £1,000 a year, taking on something like that can have a dramatic impact in terms of how you configure yourself and what you do and how. Whatever we do, we need to start thinking about the future in terms of where we are. Karen, can we just go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So we've got 2 unitaries, 8 districts, a combined authority. We may or may not have 1 or more unitaries going forwards. Ultimately, the questions for all of us are, do we engage in a discussion about the future assets and services in our area within our council now or in the future, and what do we need to do now with our principal authorities now or in the future, and what preparation? And whatever we do, let's do it mindfully, recognizing that we do have some opportunity to try and shape our future, whatever that may be, and the futures of our communities, whenever that may arise. Thank you very much. I'm sorry that was quite a long one, but it's quite a complex topic. Next slide, please, and I'm happy to try and take any questions if you have any.